Hello everyone. Welcome to day 2 of ReasonFest 2018. We have a wonderful slate of presentations that we will be enjoying today, starting with Dr. K. Christopher Beard and Dr. Pauline Cartwright. As mentioned, Dr. K. Christopher Beard will be giving the first presentation today. Dr. Beard is a distinguished professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at KU. A world-renowned expert on the primate fossil record, he received a 2000 MacArthur Fellowship Genius Award. Currently, he is the senior curator of the Biodiversity Institute. His research focuses on reconstructing the origin and early evolution of the order Primates and its major clades. He is especially interested in documenting how changes in the Earth's physical environment may have impacted the evolution of early primates and other mammalian species. Today, Dr. Beard will be educating us on some common misconceptions about primate and human evolution. Just give it up for Dr. Christopher Beard.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and I want to start by thanking Jacob, Ali, and all the other organizers of this event. Thankfully we live in a country where civil rights are being extended to new groups of people all the time. From my perspective, one of the last groups that remains too much in the closet is people who don't conform to traditional religious beliefs. So this is a great opportunity to stand up today. So I've given lots of public lectures in my career about primate and human evolution. It's become clear to me that there's plenty of non-scientific, misguided ideas about primate and human evolution that are out there in the public. A lot of it, I think, deals with this kind of image that we see behind us, which is now almost ingrained in popular culture. And that is that the whole course of primate and human evolution involves some sort of steady progress, orthogenesis, leading from primitive primates of however you want to describe them, to humans at the pinnacle of evolution. And that's one of the things that I want to emphasize today. I've got a few take-home messages in case the talk gets too boring later on. The first one is that there really isn't any evidence for progressive orthogenesis in the fossil record of primates, and humans were never a foregone conclusion during that evolutionary history. Another point that I want to emphasize is that yes, there are gaps in the fossil record. We could even call them missing links, but they don't occur where most people think they do. I want to also emphasize that random events, things that people would even consider miraculous in some ways, have really constrained primate evolution through a process called historical contingency. It's kind of like it's the same phenomenon as asking yourself if Washington had never crossed the Delaware on Christmas Eve, would the United States exist in its current fashion? I want to talk about how humans are actually not as distinct from other primates as most people think we are. And finally, I hope I've got enough time to discuss how the phylogenetic position of humans with respect to other primates actually raises some interesting ethical and philosophical questions, not only about human rights, but about animal rights and about what we might think about doing in the modern biodiversity crisis. So how did this idea about progressive evolution leading steadily toward humans get started in the first place? Well, it traces its roots at least to the beginnings of the 20th century, when early scientists like these two British scholars came up with an idea called the Arboreal theory of human evolution. Basically, the idea behind this is that as soon as you become a primate that's living in the trees, that life in the trees is inexorably going to lead to increased neurological complications, bigger brains, hand-eye coordination, even vertical postures, upright postures, and that ultimately that's going to lead steadily to humans. Now, one of the really weird after effects of this, or the implications of this idea, is that every primate alive today that's not a human has somehow failed. They've literally fallen off the wagon toward progressive evolution toward humans. And you might think that this is a crazy idea, but actually I was giving a lecture to a bunch of chemists a few years ago, and I was talking about primate and human evolution, and one of the chemists asked me, he said, well, Dr. Beard, if humans have evolved from primates, why are there still monkeys? And I kind of scratched my head and thought, well, I don't really know how to respond to that, but I basically said, you know what, not only are there still monkeys, but there's many, many more species of them than there are of us, and as far as we can tell, they're not trying to become us. So, but there's because we're people, and because we're so culturally used to thinking of ourselves as the tip top of biological evolution, or even creation, if you're thinking of it from a different perspective, you automatically have this kind of progressive view of how evolution has unfolded. And this was an early scientific effort, I think, to justify that. But let's actually take a look at primates as a whole. That's the big group of mammals. It's an order of mammals that includes humans and our closest living relatives. Obviously, apes and monkeys fall under the realm of primates, but there are also less familiar animals, lemurs, which are mainly known from Madagascar today, and also an interesting animal that lives in Southeast Asia called a tarsier, that are going to figure a little bit more prominently later on. So all of these animals have a lot of features in common, and early primatologists, including this gentleman behind me here, Sir Wilfrid Le Gros Clark, who was a British, actually the kind of founding father of primatology, active mainly in the mid-20th century, he, founding this discipline, this biological subdiscipline focused on primates, of course was interested in, okay, what about the origin of primates? How do we fit primates on an evolutionary tree compared to other mammals? And he was very much influenced by that arboreal theory that primates had to be a progressive evolution from primitive to derived, and therefore naturally Le Gros Clark searched for a primitive mammal, a mammal that was primitive enough that it could maybe be somewhere at the base of that tree. Okay? And what Le Gros Clark came up with were these animals. I hope you can see these things. They basically look a lot like squirrels. They're not actually squirrels, they're tree shrews. These animals still live today in southern and southeastern Asia. They actually behave a lot like squirrels, especially omnivorous squirrels. They scamper around on the ground. Like a squirrel, they can climb trees. But they've got claws on their fingers and toes, not nails like humans and all other primates. So they're really moving in the trees in a totally different way. But they're pretty primitive mammals. And so for Le Gros Clark, they probably fit, they were appropriately primitive, that they could fit at the base of a kind of a progressive evolutionary tree like this one, right down at the very base of that tree shrews, evolving into lemurs, evolving into tarsiers, evolving into monkeys, evolving into apes, evolving into humans. If you can memorize that, congratulations, you get an A in primate evolution, right? So this is an ancient idea that's really linked to this Greek philosophical concept of the scala naturae. Again, that humans are at the top of biological complexity. Now, by modern standards, this is not the way that we reconstruct evolutionary relationships. We don't look for animals that are incredibly primitive and stick them at the base of a tree. We have to search for what are called shared derived characters, biologically recently evolved features, and on the basis of those kinds of features, we can propose evolutionary relationships. Now, tree shrews are primitive enough that there are very, very few potential derived features that link them with other primates, things like lemurs, monkeys, apes, and us. One of the only ones that you can point to is the fact that behind the orbit of tree shrews, they have a little strut of bone that's called the postorbital bar. Every primate has that as well. In humans, we've gone beyond that. We actually have complete bony eye sockets. Just think about Halloween and all the human skulls that we see, at least images of them at Halloween. So some people have fixated on that postorbital bar and said, okay, maybe LeGros-Clark is right. After all, maybe tree shrews are close to the base of primates. But there are some problems with that idea, not least of which is tree shrew reproduction. Probably a lot of us have pet cats and dogs in our house. We're familiar with reproduction in those animals. If you ever see a neonatal puppy, you're going to notice that animal is almost helpless. It can't move very well. It can't see very well because often it's born in a condition that we would call altricial. By human standards, it would be a preemie, right? But this is probably the most primitive type of mammalian reproduction. It's basically characterized by having a very short gestation period. So the mother is not investing heavily in time and energy to bring those babies to term. It's also characterized by having a litter, not having one or maximum two neonates at one time. And finally, it's characterized by giving birth to animals like these neonatal tree shrews, which are fairly helpless. They basically have to stay kind of in a nest or something like that. The mother goes out and forages and comes back and nurses them. So this is a very different pattern of reproduction than what primates engage in. Just think of our own reproductive history. You can basically extend that even as far down as lemurs, which have long gestation periods, give birth to one, maximum two young at a time, and except for humans are weird that way. Primate neonates are not helpless. Human neonates are, but that's for a different reason. Your typical, if a monkey gives birth to a neonatal monkey, the baby monkey pretty soon can hang on to mom for dear life while she climbs up a tree. Okay? And it's fairly easy to envision why you have that kind of reproductive strategy if you're arboreal and mom has to run around through the trees. So that's a perspective on primate origins based on living organisms. What if we do like what I like to do and look for fossils? Because after all, fossils have something to do with evolution, right? So it turns out if we look at fossils and the role that they play in understanding primate origins, there's a whole group of animals. They lived mainly in the Paleocene, which is the first interval of Cenozoic life. So the Cenozoic is recent life, which differs from the Mesozoic, often called the Age of Dinosaurs. Steven Spielberg has made a mint off of that. So the Mesozoic, the transition from Mesozoic to Cenozoic was a huge transition, the dawn of the age of mammals. And some of the most common mammals that you can find if you go out and search at fossil sites that date back to this interval are these animals like this. These are called plesiadapiforms. If you look up textbooks, they're often referred to colloquially as archaic primates. All right? Now you guys know enough anatomy by now to recognize that there are some non-tree shrew-like features in the skulls of these plesiadapiforms. They don't have postorbital bars. They don't have that strut of bone behind the orbit. They retain a primitive condition for mammals in that regard. I also want to point out that one of these plesiadapiform skulls, Palekthon, in the lower right-hand corner, that's in the KU fossil vertebrate collection just next door in Dyke Hall. And so we have a great collection of these animals, actually, and it gets better every year thanks to more field work. Anyway, one of the reasons that people think that these plesiadapiforms have something to do with primate origins is their teeth. If we zero in on the teeth of these animals, they actually have some features that really look a lot like primates, to the extent that this animal called Plesiadapus, which the whole group is named after, Plesiadapus literally means ancient adipus, and adipus is a fossil primate that is known from France that everybody agrees is this lemur-like animal. So Plesiadapus and Adipus, you got the regular Adipus and the ancient Adipus. So you can see why early paleontologists thought that these animals were somehow related to primates. Now more recently, we have found virtually complete skeletons of these animals, and the story that they give us is actually incredibly interesting. It turns out that these plesiadapiforms have features throughout their skeleton that makes them much more committed to life in the trees than your standard issue tree shrew. I think we've all seen squirrels climb trees. If you're a squirrel, climbing a tree or running across the ground, it basically doesn't matter. If you climb the tree, your body posture is basically the same. You're just using your claws to dig into that bark and give you enough traction that you can make it up the tree. Plesiadapiforms, like Plesiadipus here, they also have claws. They have highly modified claws. But what they have done in their skeleton is they've basically evolved very, very mobile shoulder joints and elbow joints so that they can hold their forearms pretty much like this. Same thing with their hind limbs. Their hips are widely flexed like this and abducted. Their feet are typically inverted like so that the soles of their feet are pointing inward. And basically, there's no reason for an animal to have this kind of anatomy, so that your whole body is splayed out, kind of spread eagle, unless you want to hang out a lot on a vertical tree trunk. And by hang out a lot, I mean literally stay there for long periods of time, not simply climb up the tree, but hang out there. And so it turns out that if you look at living mammals, there's an obscure group of living mammals that live today in Southeast Asia. They're called flying lemurs. That's the colloquial name for these things. Like flying squirrels, they can glide. In fact, these animals are the champion gliders in all of mammals today. Excuse me just a sec. A flying lemur can glide the length of a football field, which is pretty amazing. But what flying lemurs don't do when they're not gliding, or what they do when they're not gliding, is they hang out on vertical tree trunks like this guy is doing now. And they actually have the same kind of body posture that we reconstruct for plesiadapiforms based on these fossil skeletons. So I don't have time to go into all of the anatomical details for why we believe these evolutionary relationships, but basically plesiadapiforms appear not to be archaic primates. They actually appear to be archaic flying lemurs. They're animals that are very primitive flying lemurs. What they show, though, is they kind of fill the gap between modern flying lemurs and modern primates. And they show that actually the nearest living mammalian relatives of primates are not tree shrews, they're actually these flying lemurs. And that has some pretty important implications for reconstructing the origin of primates. Let's look at reproduction first. That's a sexy topic, right? So like primates, flying lemurs give birth to one, maximum two young at a time. They have long gestation periods, and those neonatal flying lemurs, they're not like those preemie babies that the tree shrews have. They are so-called precocial. Why? I mean, can you look really carefully? Look at this image here. That's a baby flying lemur hanging on to mom while mom is gliding through the sky. That's why these babies have to be precocial. They can't be helpless like a tree shrew baby is. Okay? The point that I want to make is that flying lemurs and primates, the ancestor of primates and flying lemurs, already underwent a huge shift in reproductive strategy from the primitive mammalian condition of giving birth to litters, where each infant is helpless, to the primate-like strategy of giving birth to one or two babies at a time, and they're precocious. They can do stuff like hang on to mom while she glides. All right, so that's just one obvious biological similarity between flying lemurs and primates. The upshot of all of this is that LeGros-Clark was wrong. We don't have a picture of primate evolution like this with tree shrews at the base of a tree leading to steady orthogenetic progress toward humans. In fact, the base of that tree, the closest modern mammalian relative of primates is actually one of the most specialized mammals we can find in the world today, these flying lemurs. Believe me, they're the biological equivalent of kites, basically. Highly, highly specialized, all right? So that by itself, the fact that when you look at the base of this tree, you don't have a really primitive animal, in fact you have an incredibly specialized animal, tells you that evolution is not a one-way street. And if you think about it logically for just a second, this makes sense. 60 million years ago, when we shared a common ancestor with flying lemurs, during that 60 million years, our ancestors evolved from a very primitive primate-like creature to what we are today. Does it make any sense for the other lineage that diverged 60 million years ago from us to have been somehow frozen in time for 60 million years so that they remain shrew-like? No. There's no reason to think that. And so flying lemurs are about as specialized mammals as humans are today, if you just start making lists of biological features. Now, another thing that comes out of having flying lemurs at the base of the tree is it implies that the origin of primates and probably the beginning of primate evolution was probably not based in Africa, which may be news to a lot of people in this room. It actually, at that point in primate and human evolution, the earliest ancestral primates would have been based in Asia, not in Africa. And flying lemurs are restricted to Asia today. So are tree shrews, by the way. Both of those are important clues that at this particular point in primate and human evolution, the action was not in Africa, it was in Asia. And this is going to become important in just a bit. Now, despite that, I want to immediately dispel any doubts anybody has. The cradle of humanity is clearly in Africa. There's no question about that. The fossil record is good enough now that it shows that. The genetic evidence is completely compelling that the closest living relative of humans is chimpanzees. There are some important biological differences between chimpanzees and humans, and our friend the chimp here is showing us one of them in this image. The foot of chimpanzees is absolutely classic for a primate foot. All primates, with the one exception of humans, have big toes that are oriented basically at 90-degree angles to the rest of their digits. So their big toe functions a lot like a human thumb. They have grasping big toes. This fossil footprint, which I hope you can see on the left, actually looks like a footprint you would see on the beach down at Galveston or someplace. It's completely modern. You can see the imprint of the human big toe on the upper left of that footprint, and it looks like any footprint you would see on the beach. Except that footprint is from Laetoli, Tanzania, and it's more than 3 million years old. So that tells us that humans have been walking with very specialized feet for more than 3 million years, and that's one of the main differences between humans and other primates, which is kind of contrary to received wisdom as well, because we always think our heads are what separate us so much from other primates. Actually, feet are pretty important. Fossil record of primate and human evolution in Africa is completely compelling, and I'll just stress the point right now. If somebody ever asks you, oh, but what about the missing link? That's proof that humans didn't evolve from apes, right? I would say, which stage are you talking about? The fossil record in Africa at this point is actually good enough that, I hate to say it, but it's actually a little bit boring scientifically. We basically know how to turn an ape into a human. We know when it happened, we know where it happened, we know how it happened. We've got so many transitional fossils. What we're looking at here is the skull of an animal called Sahel Anthropos. Sahel Anthropos chadiensis is from Chad, outside of the East African Rift Valley system, which is where most of human fossils come from in Africa. But it stands today as probably the oldest fossil that stands a chance of being a human ancestor. This fossil is about 7 million years old. I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago to be invited to be an external evaluator for a lab in France. Professor Michel Brunet on the left here is the guy who actually found Sahel Anthropos, and so I got to hold our nearest ancestor in my hands. It was a great experience for me. So basically, if I've convinced you, and I hope that I have, that human origins can be rooted in Africa, the obvious question then is, okay, well, what about more distant primate ancestors than just humans and apes? When did they get there? And for a long time, the scientific consensus was that they didn't have to get there. They were always there. Humans and apes originated in Africa. If we go further down that evolutionary tree to monkeys, even to these so-called prosimians, there was this idea that all of these primates probably originated in Africa. We now know that that's not true. At the base of that tree, evolution was occurring in Asia, and they got to Africa later. I'm going to come back to that in just a bit. Okay, speaking of missing links, I'm going to give you guys an anatomy test real fast. My PhD is actually in anatomy. I studied at Johns Hopkins Medical School and was trained in human anatomy. But this is the kind of anatomy that you can rapidly teach your grandparents or your grandchildren, depending on where you are in terms of stage of life. Look at these 3 primate skulls and tell me which 2 look similar and which one looks different. Everybody made up your mind? It's pretty clear that the skull on the left, which is a lemur skull, looks pretty different from the skull in the middle, which is a South American squirrel monkey skull, and the skull on the right, which I think we can all recognize as a modern human skull. The point that I want to make is that in many ways, biologically, in terms of comparative anatomy, once you're a monkey, there's just little tinkering that happens to turn you into a human, at least in the skull. So if there's a missing link, I would vote that we put it right there in between these primitive primates like lemurs that don't have complete bony eye sockets. That's one of the features that I'm trying to point out here. Notice how the red arrow can go from the side of the skull past that postorbital bar and out the eye socket without actually damaging any bone. You can't do that in a human skull because we have complete bony eye sockets enclosed totally by bone, and all monkeys have that too. So I would suggest that the origin of anthropoid primates, that's monkeys, apes, and humans, was a major event in primate and human evolution. It set the standard for what later will happen in terms of human evolution. We got to take a little digression and take a look at a map of the world at the relevant point in time, which is the Eocene, about 45 million years ago. The map is familiar in many ways, but it's certainly not the same as what we're familiar with today. I've highlighted a couple of differences in the map here, one of which is that there was an epicontinental seaway that bisected Eurasia, running just to the east of the modern Ural Mountains in Russia. India was at this point colliding with southern Eurasia and was going to eventually uplift the Himalaya mountain chain and the Tibetan plateau. But the most important point for our talk today is that Africa, at this point in time, was an island continent, like Australia is today. Okay? Africa had not yet drifted northward enough that it collided with southern Eurasia in the vicinity of the modern Middle East. So Africa's isolated. And because of that isolation, the animals that lived on Africa at that point in time were, I guess we have to say, bizarre. It's not what you would think about if you go on safari in Africa today. Okay? This is an early artist's depiction of a day in the life of Africa before that collision occurred. And you see these odd-looking animals, and probably most of you would see that and you would say, well, yeah, they look a little bit weird, but they're not that weird. I mean, the big thing looks vaguely like a rhinoceros. The things that are harassing it look kind of wolf-like or jackal-like, something like that. The important point that I have to make, though, is that the thing that looks like a rhinoceros is an animal called an arsenothere. They're extinct today, but in terms of their evolutionary relationships, they're actually closer to elephants than they are to rhinos. So they have nothing to do with rhinos, even though they vaguely resemble them. The predatory mammals that are snarling at the arsenothere are not even mammalian carnivorans. Carnivorans include wolves, bears, dogs, cats, hyenas, everything you can think about today that's a predatory mammal. Those things belong to a group called creodonts, also extinct today. So the point of all of this is not to give you paleo trivia, it's to really emphasize that Africa in the early Cenozoic was weird, like Australia is today. You go to Australia today, you're going to see wombats and kangaroos and all these strange animals that don't live anywhere else except for Australia. Ditto if you went to Africa in the early Cenozoic, and guess what? There were no monkeys or apes or humans in Africa at this point in time. Zero. So this is part of the reason that I'm so confident when I tell you that at that point in time, the focus of evolution for primates and ultimately humans is Asia. Later it's going to shift to Africa. The question becomes when and how and why. Now, it turns out that the early evolutionary biologists, including Darwin himself and his contemporary Alfred Russel Wallace, were both fascinated by biogeography, the science of how do organisms come to live where they live today or where we find them as fossils, okay? And I want to quote from the good book here, The Origin of Species, of course. This is one of my favorite quotes from the good book. Darwin himself. We are thus brought to the question which has been largely discussed by naturalists, namely whether species have been created at one or more points of the Earth's surface. Undoubtedly, there are many cases of extreme difficulty in understanding how the same species could possibly have migrated from some one point to the several distant and isolated points where they're now found. Nevertheless, the simplicity of the view that each species was first produced within a single region captivates the mind. He who rejects it rejects the vera causa of ordinary generation with subsequent migration and calls in the agency of a miracle. Them's fighting words for scientists, right? We don't like miracles, okay? So what Darwin is saying is that the continuity of evolutionary descent implies continuity of geographical ranges too. You can't just pop up, I mean, God can't zap an organism into existence over here and zap that same organism into existence over there. That's anti-evolutionary, right? Okay, so let's play this game with primates, and what we see is that I've highlighted the modern distribution of primates in green on a map of the world here, and the point that I want to make is that primates show what biogeographers call a disjunct distribution. In other words, it's not continuous, okay? Separated in this case by oceans. The problem still exists even if we consider fossil primates. So I'm highlighting a bunch of fossil sites that have produced primates by red stars here. We still have problems, and one of the biggest problems is that monkeys, as we all know, live on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean today. They live both in the Amazon rainforest in South America, and they live in Africa. What you don't know yet is that there's a secondary problem, and that's that early fossil anthropoids are found only in Asia, not in Africa. So we have to explain two problems. First, how did these early anthropoids get from Asia to Africa? And second, how did these early anthropoids get from Africa to South America? Now, there's a couple of ways to deal with, to explain disjunct distributions in biogeography. One is pretty self-evident. Animals can move around. They're not sessile things like a redwood tree that are planted in one spot. Okay? So we call this kind of movement dispersal, when the animals themselves actively move from one place to another. And I want to call this kind of dispersal, like wildebeest crossing a stream in the Serengeti plains, I want to call this normal dispersal, because it's the kind of dispersal that I think all of us can easily comprehend, animals moving around a landscape. Turns out there's a second possibility for how animals get disjunct distributions. It was brought on by the plate tectonic revolution in the earth sciences in the 1960s, continental drift. There's a process called vicariance, where the animals themselves don't have to move, the ground beneath their feet shifts. Okay? And there's a classic hypothesis that flightless birds, things like ostriches, the kiwi from New Zealand, emus, rheas, moas, things like that, that these ancestral flightless birds lived in Gondwana, highlighted here in green, before Gondwana broke apart by plate tectonics and continental drift. And as Gondwana broke apart, it carried those flightless birds to the different places where they're found today, whether it's Africa, Madagascar, New Zealand, or whatever. So this process is called vicariance. Literally, the animals don't move. The animals are passive. They're just riding along on a conveyor belt caused by plate tectonics. And it turns out that this stimulated a big debate in biogeography, so that at one point we had people, biologists, arguing that basically that this explains everything. That animals almost never move long distances, that all of the differences in disjunct distributions are caused by vicariance. So this guy, Gareth Nelson, was a ringleader. He was a curator at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City for many years. And I've got a nice quote from him here saying, "The study of dispersal is a science of the improbable, the rare, the mysterious, and the miraculous." There's that word again. All right? Scientists don't like being called miraculous. Now, finally, advocates of dispersal, I think calmer heads have eventually prevailed, and people have said, okay, animals actually can move. It's not, they don't have to wait for tectonic rifting to occur. And so more recently, people have pushed back against that. But let's look again at this problem as it applies to anthropoids. Because anthropoids are still known to exist on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. And the problem basically is that even if we consider fossil anthropoids, which are highlighted in blue here, we still have a discontinuous distribution of where living and fossil anthropoids are known. And the biggest problem, if we're trying to hypothesize how these early anthropoids could walk from, let's say, the old world to the new world, the only obvious pathway, of course, is across the Bering Land Bridge, right? But here's the problem. Nobody has ever found a fossil anthropoid in North America. So it's probably true that normal dispersal, like wildebeest crossing the Serengeti plain, can't explain how anthropoids wound up on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. What about vicariance? All right, let's take a look at how the different Earth's continents broke apart. Even Wegener, the German who came up with the idea of plate tectonics, recognized that Brazil fits perfectly like two pieces of a puzzle into West Africa. All right? That was kind of the beginning of how plate tectonics and continental drift came into being. However, we now know that the rifting between Africa and South America occurred in the early Cretaceous, and there were no primates in existence that far back in the fossil record. What's even worse is the oldest anthropoids that we know about did not live in Africa or South America. They lived in Asia, so they were in the wrong place for this rifting between Africa and South America to explain how the monkeys got on both sides of the Atlantic. And finally, we know that the oldest anthropoids from Africa are only about 38 million. The rifting is 120 million. So this vicariance just isn't going to explain it for us, okay? So normal dispersal is out. Vicariance by tectonic rifting is out for explaining how monkeys got from Africa to South America. So what are we left with? I mean, we're literally throwing stuff against the wall now and seeing what'll stick. Here's what we're left with. What we call sweepstakes dispersal. Literally, monkeys floating on rafts and crossing oceans in order to colonize South America from Africa. Now, I know that that sounds crazy. The first time I thought seriously about it, I thought, well, this is such a ludicrous idea. How can this possibly be scientific? And I hate to say it, but I'm in the same boat as creationists because I actually cribbed this cartoon from a creationist website. They call this idea the Seamonkey Hypothesis, and they just laugh. They think this is the funniest thing that you can possibly come up with, that scientists think that monkeys cross the Atlantic Ocean on rafts of matted vegetation. Of course, we have to say apologies, right? Spoiler alert: this movie started out well. It was a nice love story, but the ending, not so great. So what are we talking about these rafts of natural vegetation? This is a 19th century woodcut showing a flooded Congo River in Africa, and all the flotsam and jetsam that's being washed out to sea, including what's basically a floating island right there in the middle with palm trees on it and things like that. So this basically is the proposed natural mechanism for how monkeys and other organisms can actually raft to go from one place to another. And I know it sounds crazy, but what you have to bear in mind is a couple of things. One is that we're talking about millions and millions of years here. So a very rare event, I don't know what the annual possibility of getting a monkey on a raft like this and making them float out to sea is, but let's say it's small percentage, right? But let's multiply that small percentage by 1 million years. Maybe not such a small percentage now, right? So this seems to be the mechanism that we're talking about. I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now let me take you a quick tour of some places that I've worked looking for fossil anthropoids. I'm going to start in Asia. I did some work in Myanmar. It's also called Burma. This is Shwedagon Pagoda. If you get a chance to visit Yangon sometime, I highly recommend it. One of the most amazing places on earth right now is Myanmar, a country really in transition. But the oldest fossils that we know about right now that belong to anthropoids belong to a group called eosimiids, literally meaning dawn monkeys. They have little these are tiny animals. I'm showing you, that's my finger holding a lower jaw of an eosimius fossil from China, about 45 million years old, okay? I don't have time to go into all the anatomical details about why these things are little proto-monkeys, but I'm going to show you a couple of features. This is a partial face of one of these eosimiid fossils. I want to point out first the infraorbital foramen, which all of us have. Is the little hole right here that transmits nerves and blood vessels mainly to our upper lip. This is the reason why when you go to the dentist and they shoot you with Novocaine, your upper lip goes numb depending on where they hit you with Novocaine. They're deadening the nerves that come through your infraorbital foramen. I also want to point out that we've got just a partial fragment of the lower orbit here in this animal. And it's most important to compare it directly to a monkey and to a tarsier. I told you about these tarsiers. These are nocturnal primates that live in Southeast Asia today. They've got giant eyeballs, partly because they're nocturnal. Give you one quick factoid about tarsiers. You'll remember it for your next cocktail party and be able to tell everybody about it. The volume of one tarsier eyeball equals the volume of one tarsier brain. So imagine a human skull with those proportions, right? Pretty weird. Basically, even this fragment of this eosimiid shows us that this animal had a deep face, not a shallow face like a tarsier. Therefore, we can infer that it had quite a small eye. We can infer from that these animals were active during daytime, not nocturnal like tarsiers and American teenagers. Let's take a quick look at some more anatomy. This is anatomy that again you can rapidly teach your grandchildren or grandparents depending on your stage. These are ankle bones. These are heel bones. Okay, this is the calcaneus is the technical term for this bone. On the left is the calcaneus of a modern monkey. And what I basically want you to pay attention to is that it is rather short from top to bottom and broad from side to side. On the right is the same ankle bone of an Eocene relative of tarsiers. I want you to notice that it's rather long and narrow. Okay? Short and broad versus long and narrow. Everybody got that? Here is the ankle bone of Eosimius. Which one does it look like? Looks like the monkey, right? Doesn't look like the long and narrow ankle bone on the right. So from this, we can infer ankle bones are incredibly important for primates because they climb around in trees and stuff. And so from this, we can infer that Eosimius was actually behaving like a monkey. You've seen monkeys in zoos. They run quadrupedally on tops of branches. What they don't do is leap from tree to tree like a tarsier or a primitive primate. So from this we can infer that Eosimius was already behaving like a monkey in addition to being a fairly primitive monkey. I want to quickly tell you about how small some of these Eosimiids were. The image here on the left is the biggest living primate, which is a gorilla, holding the smallest living primate, which is a mouse lemur. Now the gorilla is an anthropoid and the mouse lemur is a so-called prosimian. And from the fact that prosimians tend to be small and anthropoids tend to be big, paleontologists always had the idea that in order to evolve from being a prosimian to being an anthropoid, you have to get big. Okay, does that make sense? Because anthropoids are big. So we started finding ankle bones in China, and they look like this. Those ankle bones are exactly at the same scale as that ankle bone of the mouse lemur on the right. Let me tell you that the mouse lemur weighs 30 grams. That means 1 ounce in English units. So how big do you think the fossil primates are whose ankle bones I'm showing you in between, labeled Shanghuang A and Shanghuang D? Got to be smaller than 30 grams or 1 ounce, right? We estimate half an ounce, a third of an ounce, 10 grams, 15 grams. I mean, you're getting to be the size of a mouse now. There are no primates alive today that are that small. Mouse lemur is as little as you get, 1 ounce, okay? So what I also, now that you guys are experts on anatomy, you can also tell me that Shanghuang D is short and broad, it looks like a monkey, and Shanghuang A is long and narrow, it looks like a primitive primate. So from this, we inferred, and we actually have teeth and jaws that belong to these things. We basically envisioned these early monkeys, I like to call them micro monkeys, okay? They literally would be tiny little animals about the size of a mouse that would look like that. They would be incredibly interesting animals, highly caffeinated, frenetic animals. When you're that little, you literally have the metabolism of a shrew, so you've got to eat all the time voraciously. These things fit on an evolutionary tree like that, just at the base of all of the monkeys and above where tarsiers are. So they're incredibly interesting animals. Got to speed up a little bit to give you guys time to listen to Pauline Cartwright. Let's move quickly to Africa. I want to talk about some of the earliest monkeys that are known from there. They come from 3 main sites in northern Africa. I want to call your attention especially to the one in the middle. That's the Duratala Escarpment in southern Libya. I started working in Libya in 2010. The reason that I started working there was because at the time it was a country that had been offline from Western science for well, ever since before it had achieved its independence as an Italian colony in the early 20th century. So there were great opportunities, and at the time in 2010, it was a country that also was noted for political stability. It was colorful political leadership, but it was stability. Muammar Gaddafi's Green Revolution occurred in 1969. That was early in Richard Nixon's first term, and he was still in power in 2010. That's political stability, right? Obviously, it didn't last all that long, but let me show you the amazing landscapes that we were working in to find these fossil primates. The Duratala Escarpment is one of the most remote places on Earth, at least one of the most remote places I've ever been. Collecting fossils there is basically hanging on to a cliff face. You can't really get that sense from that image, but literally we're finding fossils almost on vertical cliff faces all the time. We have to use jackhammers to dig off the overlying sediment to get at the good stuff. The good stuff is actually rocks like I'm holding in my hand there. You may not be able to tell from where you're sitting, but there are little black and brown specks in that rock, which are actually fossils. We can train our colleagues to find them very rapidly. And in the middle of the Sahara Desert, water is at a premium, but we use that water to screen wash these rocks. It's kind of like panning for gold. It looks a lot like panning for gold. And when you do that, you actually, the sediment, the residue that you wind up with, if you sort through it under a microscope, you can find little tiny fossils like that, which is actually, that's a Libyan coin that's about the size of a quarter, and what I've highlighted in the yellow box is a rodent jaw that's obviously quite small with multiple teeth in it. So that's what we're looking for. What did we find at Duratala in Libya? We found several different kinds of fossil primates, including the oldest African anthropoids. In fact, we were shocked because the oldest African anthropoids already come in many sizes, shapes, and varieties. There's at least 3 kinds of them. I want to highlight one, a fossil called Afrotarsius libicus. One of its upper teeth is shown on this diagram on the left, and a fossil from Myanmar called Afrasia jijidi is shown on the right. Now, what I haven't told you guys is that the details of mammal teeth, including these early primate teeth, are so intricate that they basically function like fingerprints at a crime scene. I'm an expert in teeth. These teeth look an awful lot alike. They're the same age. One of them is from Myanmar in Asia. The other one is from Libya in North Africa. And from that, we think that we've got a really good handle on when these early monkeys made it from Asia to Africa. It was pretty much the time that these fossils lived. So basically, the story of this is that if you look at it in phylogenetic perspective, we know that these early monkeys were able to cross seaways, presumably by rafting, from Asia to Africa about 38 million years ago. The crazy story is that they almost didn't even stop in Africa because the earliest South American monkeys that we find are just slightly younger than that. So these things were expert sailors 38 million years ago. And as crazy as it sounds, if these little monkeys had not crossed that seaway at that point in time, I think there's a really good chance that we wouldn't be here talking about it today. And this is what I mean by historical contingency and crazy, almost miraculous things influencing evolutionary outcomes. The reason I say that is because when these anthropoids made it to Africa, what happened as soon as they got there is there was a huge adaptive radiation of anthropoids. It was an evolutionary efflorescence of monumental scale. And certainly part of that evolution included the development of anthropoid ball plans, new ways to be an anthropoid, probably ultimately including becoming an ape and then a human. Okay, so that's most of my science. Let's shift a little bit toward philosophy. I think nobody has to be reminded about how people thought about our place, the place of humanity, with respect to the rest of biodiversity on Earth prior to Darwin. It basically comes from the book of Genesis, which essentially says that God created humans in his own image, and he put them on Earth to dominate all other life forms, subjugate them, and to be fruitful and multiply. Now, after Darwin, we got a different idea. And Darwin himself, not in The Origin of Species, but in The Descent of Man, stated that as man, from a genealogical point of view, belongs to the catarrhine or old world stock of monkeys and apes, we must conclude, however much the conclusion may revolt our pride, that our early progenitors would have been properly thus designated. Now that's Victorian English, it's a bit stilted, but basically what Darwin is saying is anybody that thinks that we're not related to monkeys and apes, I got news for you. Not only are we related to monkeys and apes, we're related to old world monkeys and apes, specifically, okay? Now, despite that, scientists, even scientists after Darwin, have engaged in a long history of trying to separate humans from our closest primate relatives. This is an early 20th century phylogenetic tree, which basically shows humans on the left side and all of the different kinds of apes on the right. What I want to draw your attention to is that the divergence, according to this phylogenetic tree, between humans and apes goes back to the Oligocene. That's 30 million years ago. And notice that all the apes are clumped together on one side, the humans are isolated. What we know today is that not only is the shape of that tree wrong, but the timing is definitely wrong. This is what the actual tree looks like. All right? Now, I know that some of you in the audience are going to disagree. You're going to say, look, it's rather clear that at least based on that picture of a human, there's a lot of similarities with orangutans, and so maybe the tree is drawn improperly here. But I'm telling you, this is the cutting edge of science. This is what the tree looks like. And that important divergence that all of us are focused on between chimpanzees and humans didn't occur in the Oligocene 30 million years ago. Our best estimates based on molecular genomics and based on the fossil record is it probably occurred about 7 million years ago in Africa. And to give you some perspective, the divergence between cats and bobcats occurred about 7 million years ago. All right, so if bobcats, well, cats are special. I'm a cat owner, all right? So if that's how long it takes to turn a bobcat into a cat, or for those things to diverge from a common ancestor, and a chimp and a human to diverge from a common ancestor, I'm not offended. But it's definitely different from what a lot of people have been taught to believe. So what in the world does this mean about ethics, about philosophy? Let me pose a thought experiment for you. This is one of my favorite fossils. It's about 1.8 million years old. It was found by Lewis and Mary Leakey in Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania. It was originally called Zinjanthropus boisei, the Nutcracker Man. It's an amazing fossil. Today it's either called Australopithecus boisei or Paranthropus boisei. Amazing adaptations, teeth heavily evolved for grinding, very flat, giant molars that they were grinding something, maybe nuts. The original designation of Nutcracker Man may be appropriate there. What if a lucky anthropologist found a living population of these things in some forest in Central Africa? How would we deal with them? I'm pretty sure the conservation biologists would be all over it and say, oh, we've got to pull out all the stops. We got to keep these things from going extinct because they're close human relatives. That's the minimum. I'm pretty sure that some ethicists would also say, well, geez, maybe these guys deserve some of the rights that we normally restrict to humans. We probably shouldn't perform medical experiments on them. And for sure, we shouldn't hunt them and eat them, which is actually what's happening to chimpanzees and gorillas in Africa today. Pretty close to cannibalism. I don't have all the answers to this, but I do think that the nestedness of humans within primates, as opposed to being strongly separate from all other primates, has something to say about human rights and animal rights and how we should think about that going forward. That's pretty much all I've got. I want to thank the people in the host countries that I've worked in. They've had it rough. So it's a tough world out there, but science is an amazing thing. I'll try to answer any questions if people have any. Thank you very much. I think she's got the first one, it looks like. Don't you?
Oh, okay. I'll stand up to help. Is there any scientific evidence that things like during the million-year period between the rift opening up and the separateness, is there any scientific evidence that perhaps natural disasters like tsunamis and flooding could have created a situation for the rafting type of migration?
That's a great question, and I'm sorry I just kind of glossed over this rafting thing. I think it's so cool and so weird that I had to talk about it. But yeah, in fact, this is an area of scientific exploration that has really kind of borne a lot of fruit in the last few years. Actually, a former postdoc of mine here at KU, he's now on the faculty of the University of Washington, I think he published a very important study in Nature in 2014, where this guy is an expert on reconstructing ancient climate, and what he found out was that during the time that all of this rafting was going on, that the world's climate was hyper greenhouse conditions. The level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was much greater even than it is today, and because of that, we think about these kind of giant hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico that are happening today. In the Eocene, 38 million years ago, when we had this hyper greenhouse condition, these would have been monumental storms. Monsoons, huge monsoons in southern Asia, northern Africa. And so every year, multiple times a year, there would have been giant flooding events that would have swept a lot of flotsam and jetsam out to sea, like that one image that I showed you. And so it actually makes sense that at that particular point in time, when the climatic conditions were so much stoked for this kind of monsoonal rainfall, that's when these monkeys went everywhere. Believe it or not, after that, the world became cooler and drier, and we can study the fossil record, and nobody was going anywhere then. So everything is based on the ancient climate regime, and yes, you're right. It was that's what controls a lot of this rafting, which is we've only found out about that in the last couple of years. I think he had a question first, and then I'll go to you. Yeah.
I was just curious, how close were the continents at the time?
So Africa versus southern Asia was hundreds of kilometers. We're probably talking 500 kilometers at the closest point of land. But bear in mind that through time, that distance was getting shorter and shorter all the time because of continental drift. Africa's getting closer and closer. It finally collides. But what's interesting, so based on what I just told you, they're getting closer and closer through time, so you would think it would be easier and easier for animals to raft, right? Because the length of sea is less. In fact, it's not true. Early in time, when the seaway was wider, it was easier for the rafting to occur because of the climate, because of all the monsoonal conditions. Just as Africa was getting ready to dock with Southern Asia, the climate became cold and dry, and nobody rafted, even though the distance was not very far. So that's really an interesting discovery that's happened just in the last few years. I think you had a question?
Oh, I think when I talk about this with friends that believe, instead of a raft, I'm going to call it an ark.
Yeah, they might like it. But be careful, because like I said, that Seamonkey Hypothesis is out there on creationist websites. So, yes, in the back.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm not sure. What does the genetics say about the African and versus South American monkeys?
Right.
How close is that? And is there a genetic clock that verifies from some other angle?
The genetics and the paleontology are pretty much in sync on this right now. That wasn't the case 20 years ago because people were obviously resistant, and for good reason, about this idea of monkeys rafting across oceans. And so there's a long history in paleontology of trying to find ancestral South American monkeys, for example, in North America. The problem is all of us have looked, and by now the North American fossil record, it's not been completely scoured. There's still reasons to look for fossils, but I think we all feel pretty confident that if there were monkeys in North America, we would have found them by now. What genomic information tells us is the same thing that comparative anatomy does, and that is that South American monkeys and Old World monkeys, apes, and humans all form one lineage, but out of all of those, the South American monkeys are the first ones to branch off, okay? So that's why Darwin, in that quote that I mentioned, said that our early ancestors would have been called catarrhines. The South American version of monkeys are platyrrhines, and so Darwin already knew that in 1873, I think was the date of that. So the catarrhine are the Old World monkeys, apes, and humans. So we're actually, in an evolutionary sense, we're more closely related to baboons than we are to, let's say, squirrel monkeys or spider monkeys.
So there had to be a genetic bottleneck, from Africa to South America. Only maybe 3 basic species came across. Is that correct? Or were there 20 species
and this is, now you're raising another issue that I didn't have quite enough time to go into in great detail. The interesting, for South America, I believe you're correct. All of the data that we have about early fossil monkeys in South America suggests that there was only one colonization by monkeys of South America. So you only have to raft one troop, family, whatever. I mean, you've got to get a sustainable genetic population to South America. So one monkey isn't going to do it, right? But apparently only one species of monkey was required. What I want to say, and I can't go into all the details, but apparently the original colonization of Africa by early anthropoids was more complicated. It's looking like multiple species of Asian anthropoids colonized Africa at about the same time. So that was not a simple issue. Maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
Were there any other non-primates that would have made that trip with the monkeys that kind of would help corroborate?
Thank you for asking that question. The answer is yes. Let's talk about South America first. All of the native rodents of South America belong to a group called the Hystricognathi. And examples of those things that we're all familiar with are things like chinchillas, capybaras, guinea pigs. All of those rodents that are today native to South America can trace their evolutionary relationships to African rodents that belong to the same group. And what the fossil record shows is that, I mean, these ancestral Hystricognath rodents may well have been on the same raft with the ancestral monkeys that got to South America. Same thing with Africa. Rodents and primates seem to be the best mammals for going places on these rafts. It's partly because they're small, And you can imagine if you've got a raft of this dimension, maybe you can, if you're lucky, you could isolate maybe 10 small monkeys or 10 rodents on a raft like that. If you're a goat, one maximum, right? So even if you've got a goat on a raft and the goat makes it to Africa, good for the goat, right? Maybe it has a nice life, but you're not going to get a population of goats developing in Africa based on that. So partly it's based on body size, partly it's based on whether or not you like to live near riverbanks. If you live in desert areas, you're never going to wind up on a raft because you're just in the wrong ecosystem. It also helps apparently to be arboreal, to live in trees. I think a lot of these animals, they're simply hanging on for dear life through a monsoon next to a riverbank. They're huddled together in a tree, and suddenly the ground caves off beneath them, and now they're sailors, right? They're being swept out to sea, and hopefully something good happens. Not always does it. Finally, there's actually some behavioral ecology that probably feeds into this. It helps if you're a gregarious species, like monkeys are great examples of this. They like to live in troops, because that means you're more likely to isolate a viable genetic population on one of these rafts than if you're an animal that doesn't like to, that's more solitary. Then it becomes very difficult to get a bunch of animals on one or more rafts. So a lot of biology and some geology go into this. It's a really fascinating area that people are devoting a decent amount of resources to looking at right now. Is that enough? Okay. Thanks, everybody.